Don't all talk at once now. All right, so a couple reminders before we jump back into the shoulder. I had asked all of you to email me the idea for your lab project. So a lot of you have, but there were some that, as of a couple hours ago, still hadn't emailed me. So make sure that you email me. Many topics are taken, so your best bet is to email me a couple ideas. If I don't hear from you, I'm just going to assign you an activity, and I could assign whatever I want, and you may or may not like it. So I encourage you to pick your own activity. As I said to you last week, what I'm going to do is by the 18th, today's the 11th. So by next Thursday, when we meet for our Zoom lecture next Thursday, I will tell you when your lab assignment is due. Because remember, the last couple labs are just the lab presentations. So next Thursday, a week from today, I will have a schedule. So you will know when your lab presentation is. And of course, your final lab project is due the same day as your presentation. Okay. Reminder that there's no lab today. We couldn't have lab on Monday, so I can't do lab today. So we just have the lecture here. Next week, we're back to our regular schedule of lecture and lab. Okay.
Dr. Jenkins.
Yeah.
I don't know if you got my email, but I asked about the like the remaining exams and the final exam. Is the final exam, is that a cumulative final, or is what to deal with all that?
Yeah, so I apologize. I've been a little bit being at home with some of my responsibilities. I've been a little bit behind on email, but I can answer your question right now. So the final exam will be cumulative.
Fuck. Bro.
Because we're all online, what I'll probably end up doing, so usually when we're in class, I give you the paper exam, and usually the final exam is between 100 and 125 questions, multiple choice. The questions on the final exam are a little bit more general than the ones for the unit exams. The final exam will be in order. So you, for example, you'll see chapter 1 questions, then you'll see chapter 2 questions. But what I've done for my other online classes, I think 100 or 125 questions online is kind of hell. So what I have done in my other classes is I've broken it down into 3 or 4 like quizzes. So you can imagine, you know, if we cover, I don't know, 10 total chapters, I didn't count, but let's just say it's 10, maybe I'll have I'll have the final exam broken up into 3 sections. So you can choose to take one section at a time if you want. That will help you as you study, but it will also make doing it online a little bit easier. Once we get closer to the final exam, I'll give you more information about it. I really haven't thought about it, to be honest with you. You know, for your unit exams, I've been having you log on to Zoom so I can see you. But if I give the final exam in chunks, you know, maybe I'll offer like a couple times, or I got to think about it. But I'm pretty sure I'll break it up, just because I think doing so many questions at once online is hell.
Okay. And then is there 1 or 2 more regular lecture exams?
So we have 4 total exams, unit exams, and everything is on I posted an updated schedule.
Okay.
On the syllabus. So we have 2 more regular exams. As it stands right now, our 3rd unit exam is scheduled not this coming Monday, but a week from then, Monday, March 22nd. And then our fourth lecture exam is scheduled a little bit later, Monday, April 19th.
Okay.
But you'll see on the syllabus, I've given the updated schedule because it changed a little bit because of our snow day.
All right, thank you.
Do we have any other questions, comments? As I've said to you before, please don't wait too long to be working on your lab project because it takes some time. We do have lab next week, but the following week, I've purposely set a week where we don't have lab scheduled, just so you have time to work on it. So there's no excuse, you got plenty of time. It's built into the schedule. Okay. All right, so we're gonna finish the shoulder. We started the shoulder a week ago. Now let's finish it. If we get back into that frame of mind, we talked about 5 main joints in and around the shoulder. So it's not just what we think of as the shoulder. There's many joints working together. What is the name of the joint that we actually usually call the shoulder joint? I'm going to ask you a couple quiz questions just to get you back thinking. What's the name of the ball and socket joint that we tend to call the shoulder?
Glenohumeral.
Glenohumeral joint. It's a ball and socket joint. Sorry, I'm just grabbing something from down here. What kind of motions are allowed at a ball and socket joint?
Everything.
Well, can you be more specific, please?
Yep. Flexion, extension, internal and external rotation, AB and adduction, and circumduction.
Very nice. When we talked about the glenohumeral joint, would you say it has much bony stability?
No.
No.
No, remember? So it's got a really big head of the humerus, but kind of a smaller socket. So we don't have as much strength, but what do we get on the other end of that?
More mobility, range of motion.
Yeah, so you can't have your cake and eat it too. We can't have a really strong bony joint and also have a lot of motion. Just can't happen. So with the shoulder, we have to sacrifice some of that bony stability in order to get all that range of motion. Who can tell us what the closed pack position is of the shoulder? We may recall that the closed pack position of a joint is when there's the most bone-on-bone contact. What is the closed pack position of the shoulder?
90 degrees of abduction.
Dan's just on the ball. Did you have your Wheaties, Dan?
No, I actually just got out of bed. I had to work an overnight last night.
And you just got up and now you're answering these questions like a boss?
Yeah.
And you guys are impressed because I did some biking. I mean, all right. Other things to review. Let's see. We talked about the supporting ligaments of the glenohumeral joint. We have the actual glenohumeral ligaments. We have a smaller ligament called the coracohumeral ligament. The ligaments give some support, but they're not a major stabilizer of the shoulder. What do we rely on most to stabilize the glenohumeral joint? It's not that strong, bony structure. The ligaments are only so-so. So what do we rely on most to stabilize the shoulder?
Muscles.
We do. What muscles? It's a muscle group.
The rotator cuff.
The rotator cuff. We also talked about the joint capsule of the glenohumeral joint. So we know that every synovial joint has like a saran wrap joint capsule. we said that the joint capsule is not elastic, correct? So I gave the example of a shoulder dislocation. So what if the head of the humerus pops out? It stretches that joint capsule, and the joint capsule is not elastic. So part of that joint capsule stays stretched out, and that is one of the main reasons why shoulder dislocations, after you have one, you're much more likely to have another. Is this sounding somewhat familiar? Talked about the bursa, fluid-filled sacs. You don't need to know the specific bursa around the glenohumeral joint, but you need to know what they are. Okay, we talked about the labrum. So we have an extra piece of cartilage that sits on the outer rim of the glenoid cavity. So I gave you the analogy of the labrum like the rubber piece around a mason jar lid. So the labrum gives extra cushioning, and it has like almost a vacuum kind of effect. Helps keep the joint together. All right. Then we began talking about the scapulothoracic joint. Let's see where we ended here. Where did we end? We discussed the scapulothoracic joint between the scapula and the rib cage, didn't we?
Yes.
You guys having a hard time hearing me? Someone's saying audio issues. Okay.
Yeah, you kicked off for a minute and now you came back on and I couldn't hear you.
All right. I'm going to keep my chat open. So if that happens, I can repeat myself. So just send me a little chat. Maybe the internet isn't quite as good here or something. And just so you know, I'm also recording this. So if we have any other technical problems, it'll record on my computer and I'll post it on my YouTube channel. I'll give you the link. Okay, so the scapulothoracic joint, that is the scapula as it is attached to the rib cage. What type of joint is that? The scapulothoracic joint.
That one's undefined.
Yes, every once in a while, a joint's a little bit different. And that is the case with the scapulothoracic joint. So it doesn't fit into any of the other categories that we learned, fibrous, cartilaginous, or synovial. So it's kind of an undefined joint. It does have a little bit of motion. And we talked about the motion, scapular elevation, depression, protraction, retraction. We also talked about a major function of the scapulothoracic joint is that it helps us get more glenohumeral motion. So that's an important thing. Just make sure that we're there. So not only can the scapulothoracic joint give us elevation, depression, protraction, retraction, having that arrangement of the scapulothoracic joint allows us to get more glenohumeral joint motion. Okay. Then we talked about scapulothoracic rhythm. We did that in lab. So for every 1 degree of scapular lateral rotation, we get 2 degrees of glenohumeral motion. That should be a review. Okay. We ended last week talking about the acromioclavicular joint between the acromion of the scapula and the clavicle. This is also considered kind of an irregular joint. And we talked about the motion of the acromioclavicular joint. Who can remind us? How did we define the motion that's allowed at the acromioclavicular joint?
Gliding.
Yay! Gliding. So it's not necessarily an angular motion that we can classify as flexion or extension, but it does do a little bit of gliding. Good. I mentioned the clavicle. We talked about that, please don't say collarbone. We know it's clavicle. Of course, the clavicle comes out, and that's what forms part of the acromioclavicular joint. I mentioned, why on earth do we have a clavicle? Who can remember why we have that funky shaped bone? Oh, hi, Ruger. You want more treats? Maybe the dog can tell me why we have a clavicle.
It distributes forces. It acts as a lever and distributes forces.
Perfect. So it does kind of act as a lever to connect our sternum to our scapula, the acromion process of our scapula. And in doing so, it also helps to distribute some of the forces. Good. I did mention one ligament we have there. It's the acromioclavicular joint, and it is surrounded by the acromioclavicular ligament. No one should miss that one, right? So it's the acromioclavicular joint, and it is encapsulated by the acromioclavicular ligament. We also have one that's called the coracoacromial ligament. It wasn't in the picture, but I just put it on there so you knew it existed, but I'm not too worried about it. And then what I ended with, if my memory is correct, what do we call when we damage that acromioclavicular ligament? If we sprain the acromioclavicular ligament, what is it typically? What's the name of that injury?
A separated shoulder.
Yeah, so separated shoulder. It gets that name because as the AC ligament stretches, sometimes there'll be a separation between the clavicle and the acromion. Just because the ligament stretched out, the bones are no longer quite side by side. They're a little bit separated. Sometimes, this is extra, what I'm about to say is extra. By the way, I would like you to be able to pair together that a separated shoulder is a sprain to the AC ligament, acromioclavicular ligament. What I'm going to say now is extra. Sometimes if someone has that injury, oh, hold on. Can you get that toy? Yeah. Thank you. Sometimes with that injury, the end of the clavicle pops up. Have you ever seen that before with a separated shoulder? If you sprain this ligament, the lateral end of the clavicle pops up. Sometimes even after it heals, it's a little bit up. Have you ever seen that? Okay. There's an actual test you can do. It's called the piano key sign. This is extra. It's called the piano key sign. So if that's popped up, like a broken piano key pops up. So if you press down on that and it pops back up, not that you needed the confirmation, but it's an injury to the acromioclavicular ligament. Okay, let me grab my marker here. Have you ever heard of a mechanism for injury called FOOSH? F-O-O-S-H. Have you ever heard of that?
Yes.
Oh, well, of course Dan has. Dan, I feel like you'd be a good person for those old commercials where they said, oh, I slept at a Holiday Inn last night, and they wake up the next morning.
Maybe.
Maybe. Oh, I slept at a Holiday Inn. I can be a doctor now. Oh, I slept at a Holiday Inn. I can build your house. So there's something called Foosh. And I'm putting this out, so I would like you to know this. It's just a shorthand of saying fall on outstretched hand. Fall on outstretched hand. So, you know, if you're about to fall, we kind of reflexively put our hand out to brace us. And commonly what happens is the forces of our hand meeting the ground, the forces get transmitted up from our wrist to our elbow. And typically the weakest thing along that chain is the acromioclavicular joint. So a lot of times people who sprain this AC joint do so through a Foosh mechanism. They fall off a ladder or something, and they put their hand out to brace them, fall on outstretched hand, but the forces get transmitted to the weakest joint, which is often the acromioclavicular joint. Foosh. So much easier to write down in your notes than fall on outstretched hand. Okay, I'm going to pull up the PowerPoint again so we can see our next joint. I'm not going to be able to see the chat. So if I cut out, when I come back in, just yell at me. You know, say, hey, we missed that. Can you say it again? All right, share screen. Okay. All right. All right, so the next joint we're going to talk about is the coracoclavicular joint. I know this is kind of tedious, isn't it? Because we have a lot of small joints in and around here. But the good thing is that the joints are named for the bones they connect. So when you hear coracoclavicular, boom, you already know. Well, it's got to be a joint between the coracoid process and the clavicle. And remember, in lab, when I had you do some of that palpation, part of that is to help us with the anatomy. So I remember I was trying to help you. You know, the coracoid process was deep right in here, and it kind of was, it hurt when you pressed on it a little bit. So I'm not going to test you on those palpations, but I do expect you to remember this anatomy. So we just talked about the acromioclavicular joint between the acromion process of the scapula and the clavicle. Now we're talking about the coracoclavicular joint between the coracoid process and the clavicle. Okay. This is another one of those not definable joints. So you'll see in your notes type of joint. It really doesn't fit into any one category, so we can just say it's not defined. And in terms of movement, there really isn't that much movement here. So I might say very little movement. Not even necessarily appreciable gliding. There's really not much going on here in terms of movement. But there is a ligament. And guess what? It's called the coracoclavicular ligament. It's not so bad. Technically, if you wanted to get all fancy, technically, if you can see on the screen, the coracoclavicular ligament has two parts. Technically, they're named the trapezoid and conoid ligaments, but you don't need to know that. So if there's not a whole lot of motion here, why do we even have ligaments to connect the clavicle to the coracoid process? the function isn't really for movement, but why on earth would we have these ligaments there to connect them? Excuse me. So if the function isn't mobility, why do we even have this?
Stability.
Yeah, I mean, more or less to kind of hold these bones together. It's another way to stabilize the clavicle. The clavicle is a pretty weak bone. So its function is more about holding this together. Okay. On our next exam, you know, these questions, I know it's kind of dry and boring, but if you know the anatomy, you should be able to fly right through those questions, particularly because the joints and the ligaments are named for the bones they connect. So no matter where you are with the anatomy, make sure you get really good at it because it'll make this much easier. Well, on the other end of the acromioclavicular joint is the sternoclavicular joint between the medial end of the clavicle and the sternum. We palpated the sternum in lab. That top little notch is called the jugular notch. This is called the manubrium. It's like a puzzle piece. You can see the sternum has like a little convex part on either end that the clavicle just fits right into. Now, there is some motion here. This joint, the sternoclavicular joint, this joint is considered to be a modified ball and socket. You should write that down. I mean, it's like a tiny ball and socket, isn't it? It's got this concave surface and then the convex surface. As such, because it's a modified ball and socket joint, it can do a little bit of abduction and adduction, and it can do a little rotation. Slight, but it's there. So it's a modified ball and socket joint, and it can do a little bit of abduction, adduction, and a little bit of rotation. See what I have in my notes here, make sure I'm following along with you. There are some ligaments we're going to discuss, but before we do that, there's kind of a unique little thing going on here. I know, how exciting can the sternoclavicular joint be? It can be pretty exciting. Let me zoom in. So if you look between the joint surfaces, you'll see right here it says articular disc. So basically, between the clavicle and the sternum is a little cartilage disc. It's not quite like the labrum where it's ring shaped. This is just a little wedge of cartilage. And anytime we have extra cartilage, one reason it's there is for shock absorption. And as a second thing that I'm not going to ask you on any exam, but just FYI, that disc does help the joint surfaces to fit together a little better. But we'll just go with the function of this disc is that it's shock absorption. So indeed, there's some motion there. If there wasn't any motion here, we wouldn't bother having a little disc. Okay. You can see on your notes there, I list the ligaments in and around the sternoclavicular joint. This picture is from the Hall book. I was just sitting here thinking about which ones I want to have you know. But I think we're just going to keep it as knowing the anatomy. So if I were to ask you a question about any of these ligaments, you would know where it is because the name of the ligament tells you. So the sternoclavicular ligament goes between the sternum and the clavicle. That's the main ligament. Then we have a costoclavicular ligament, goes between the rib and the clavicle. So the prefix costo means rib. And then we have an interclavicular ligament, which means it goes between the clavicles. Who knew that the sternoclavicular joint had so much to offer to us? This joint, in terms of its bony structure, is not very strong. So that's why we have that little disc there of cartilage, and it's why we have so many ligaments. Okay. Those are the joints in and around the shoulder. How we doing? Can I tell you that when I packed to come down here, I only packed long sleeve jerseys for my bike because it was so cold. Well, it's warm here, so I had to buy a jersey. It has little crabs on it. You know, Maryland steamed crabs. So it's a white jersey with little red crabbies. It's the cutest thing. But I'm guessing all of you like lobster. Is that the deal? Because you're Northeast people. If given the choice, and your grade depends on this, would you rather have a steamed lobster or steamed Maryland blue crab? Your grade
Lobster.
depends on this answer.
Lobster. Crabs are too much work.
You're offending my family in the background, but that's okay. It's just where you're from. Because to me, lobster tastes bland, even though I know you dip it in butter. But I think it has a lot to do with like memories, right? These are the moments when I try and just interrupt the boring lecture to get you to talk, but you don't even do that. I thought food would.
We would, but it's lagging a little bit. So we're catching it as it comes in.
I'm so sorry about that. My connection says it's good. Is that happening for a lot of people?
Yeah, mine's going crazy, like all choppy.
Yeah, same here.
Yeah, it happens a little bit, but
Okay.
Same here.
I apologize. My connection is good, so I thought it would be okay. But like I said, I'm recording it. So if you need to fill in any gaps, or don't hesitate to ask me again. I can repeat something. Okay, so the next part, and we're going to follow the same structure for each joint. So we talked about the bony structures. Now we're going to talk about the muscles. I've been working hard to get you to learn the muscles if you haven't already, if you don't already remember them. In lab, we spent some time working with the muscles. And I find that this is an area where the students usually need some review. So please, pretty please review the muscles. All right, so let's talk about them. Now, one thing to remind ourselves, and we've gone over it again and again, the glenohumeral joint, it does not have a lot of bony stability. Its ligaments are so-so. So what do we rely on most for the glenohumeral stability? Muscles. So in terms of the shoulder, not only do we rely on muscles in and around it to move the arm, but we also rely on the rotator cuff muscles to stabilize the shoulder. So I got some review, and these are coming right from your notes. Make sure you review the muscles that do the scapular motions. We did it in lab, right? I had you come to the board and then write one agonist for each motion. Does that sound familiar? Okay. These are also good pictures. So for example, and I'm going to post this PowerPoint today after our lecture. So if you want to know what is a muscle that does scapular elevation, we look at this picture. Well, elevation is going up. So we have levator scapulae, upper trapezius, and the rhomboids to a smaller degree, but focus on the one agonist. For scapular elevation, it's levator scapulae. For scapular depression, lower trapezius. Scapular retraction, rhomboids. Scapular protraction, serratus anterior. And we did this in lab. Okay. So let's see how I want to talk about this. Okay, let's go through the muscles listed in your lecture sheet. So they're listed by region. We have anterior glenohumeral muscles, posterior, and then we have lateral, and then the rotator cuff. And let's just give one function for each. All right, you help me out. Pectoralis major, what is its primary function? Pectoralis major.
Would it be flexion?
That's not its main function. Part of it may assist with shoulder flexion, but there's something bigger.
Horizontal adduction.
Horizontal adduction. So when we give an action, we're going to want to give the joint and the motion. So for the pectoralis major, we would say shoulder horizontal adduction. The deltoid, we're going to separate into 3 regions. So what is the primary function of the anterior deltoid? I just did it. Starting here and going up.
Shoulder flexion.
Shoulder flexion. So the anterior fibers of the deltoid assist with shoulder flexion. The middle fibers of the deltoid do shoulder abduction. And the posterior fibers of the shoulders of the deltoid, the posterior fibers of the deltoid do shoulder extension. Tell me, how do you feel about muscles? Because I feel like I'm drilling it into your heads. Do you feel comfortable with them or need more review? Are they tougher for you?
I mean, I'm pretty comfortable with them.
Me too.
Okay. But how come it's so quiet then when I ask what one of the functions is? It's okay. I would never pressure anyone. So there might be some smaller muscles that we introduce here. So look at this picture here. Underneath the biceps brachii and the deltoid, we have a muscle called the coracobrachialis. And see, as you learn the anatomy more and more, better and better, well, coracobrachialis, the reason it begins with the prefix coraco is because it originates in the coracoid process. And then it goes to the humerus. So let me give you one of the functions of the coracobrachialis. The coracobrachialis is a muscle that does a little bit of shoulder adduction. And I think that makes sense with where the muscle's at. When this muscle shortens, it pulls the humerus down. So you should know one function of the coracobrachialis, shoulder adduction. Not horizontal adduction like the pec major, just plain old adduction. Of course, the biceps brachii has two heads, long and short. Everyone knows the main function of the biceps, elbow flexion. But one of those, is there a better picture here? Let's see. Come on. Doesn't like the biceps brachii, that's fine. One of the long head of the biceps goes up between the bicipital groove and it attaches kind of above the shoulder. So because that one tendon comes above the shoulder, the long head of the biceps can do a little bit of shoulder flexion. You should know that. Long head of the biceps brachii helps with shoulder flexion. The rest of the biceps brachii, we know it flexes the elbow. I've also posted a handout, and it's also, I think it's in your binder, a summary of the muscles, origin, insertion, innervation. I'm just having you fill in the action. So that could be a good table to summarize everything, make it a little easier. All right, our posterior muscles, we already know the posterior deltoid can help with shoulder extension. The triceps, it's not shown here, but the triceps, what is the main function of the triceps brachii? Main function of the triceps? At the elbow?
Extension.
Extension. So the triceps brachii does elbow extension. The trapezius. Everyone knows the trap. Make sure in any short answer question, you write down the whole muscle, right? Please don't say trap or lats. Spell it out. Trapezius. Let's just break it down into the upper fibers of the trapezius, middle fibers, and lower fibers. And I'm giving you primary functions, right? The upper part can do scapular elevation, upper trapezius, scapular elevation, middle trapezius, scapular retraction, Lower trapezius depresses scapula. Lower trapezius depresses scapula. Now, let's talk about one of my favorite muscles in the whole human body, the latissimus dorsi. Everyone knows the lats, right? Latissimus dorsi. If you check out its origin and insertion, right, where the tendon originates and where it inserts, it's a big, broad muscle, yeah? So we think of the lats as because it's on the back, but what's cool about the lats is that even though most of the muscle belly is in the back, the insertion comes around from the back to the front of the humerus. So I'd like you to understand a little bit about where the lats insert. I'm not going to ask you specific questions about origins and insertions, but I'd like you in general to know that, you know, most of the latissimus dorsi is on the back, but it comes around and its tendon inserts on the front of the humerus. It's a pretty wild arrangement. It actually inserts on the lesser tubercle, one of the things that we practice palpating in lab. But because this muscle attaches on the humerus, when this muscle contracts, what joint does it move? Because this muscle inserts on the humerus.
The glenohumeral.
Yeah. So if you know, it's kind of a little, it goes against what you might think because the majority of the muscle is in your back. So you might think, well, it moves my back, but it doesn't move your back at all. It doesn't move your trunk one bit. Understanding where that muscle, where the lats inserts, it comes up to a small insertion point on the front of the humerus. And that's exactly why this muscle moves the shoulder. It moves the glenohumeral joint. All right. When I think of the actions of the latissimus dorsi, and I mentioned it to somebody in lab, I forget whether it was Monday or Thursday. I think it was Thursday. I think of the latissimus dorsi as the handcuff muscle. Now, I don't know this by experience. Someone had just told me. But if you think about, if you think about when someone is handcuffed, right? What's happening at their shoulder? So this is an example of if I put my arm in that position, and then I think about what's happening at my shoulder in that position, that tells me all the motions that the latissimus dorsi does. Here's a muscle where I'd like you to know all of its actions, not just one. So if I'm doing handcuff position, right? My shoulder is extended. So the lats do shoulder extension. The lats do shoulder adduction. Aren't I adducted in this position? So my shoulder is extended and adducted. My shoulders are extended and then adducted. And then lastly, in a handcuff position like this, would you say that the shoulder is internally rotated or externally rotated?
Internally rotated.
Internal rotation, because my palms are facing out. So that's exactly what the lats do. Shoulder extension, shoulder adduction, and shoulder internal rotation. It would be quite odd to be handcuffed with your hands in external rotation. That'd be really weird. But they're internally rotated. So if you put your hands in that position and then you break down the motions occurring at the shoulder, the lats do shoulder extension, shoulder adduction, and shoulder internal rotation. When I taught this for the first time years and years and years ago, I made the mistake of going like this, like crossing my hands. And I had a student say, "Oh, no, 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 Professor Jenkins, when you get handcuffed, your wrists don't cross. They're just side by side." So apparently, that student had more experience than I. Not that anybody in this class would know anything about that. Does that make sense when I break it down like that? I know it works for me in my brain, but does it work in your brain? Michael's nodding. Okay, the last muscle on that list there, posterior muscles, is the teres major. I have a good picture. Oh, sorry. Here's the teres major. So if you look down here, this is latissimus dorsi. Right above it is the teres major. But we're going to make life pretty easy as we can. One easy way to remember the teres major, it's frequently called the little lats. And all that means is it does the same actions as the lats. So the teres major is just a smaller muscle right above it, but it does the same exact motions as latissimus dorsi. Teres major. We are going to see a teres minor also, so just be careful. The little lats, quote unquote, what does the exact same motions as latissimus dorsi is the teres major. Okay, I got plenty of pictures of muscles on here. You also have the what's in your binder, all those muscles there. There's a teres major. Okay, last thing I'm going to talk about before we finish off this chapter would be the rotator cuff muscles. The rotator cuff muscles are deep. So look at this picture. On this side, we see the superficial muscles, right? Trapezius, deltoid, latissimus dorsi. Well, if we peel back the trapezius and deltoid deeper, literally surrounding the scapula are the rotator cuff muscles, commonly referred to as the sits muscles, because that's an easy way to remember them, SITS, supraspinatus, infraspinatus, teres minor, subscapularis. I'd like you to have a general idea of where these muscles are. The supraspinatus is the one above the spine of the scapula. Supra, I think it's like super on top. So the supraspinatus is kind of on top. The infraspinatus and teres minor are on the posterior side. So just have a general idea. Supraspinatus is on top, infraspinatus and teres minor on the posterior side, which means the subscapularis is the only one that's on the anterior side. In lab, we talked about some of the function of these muscles, right? So I'm going to ask you to review your lab for the functions. But in addition to maybe helping with shoulder flexion or shoulder internal external rotation, what is one function that all rotator cuff muscles share? What is one function that all rotator cuff muscles share?
Stability of the shoulder.
Yes, so even though they help with some of the glenohumeral motions, one of the primary functions of the rotator cuff muscles is to stabilize the shoulder. They're deep, all their tendons come up and around the head of the humerus, so they kind of hold in the head of the humerus, and in doing so, they give it a lot of, stability. So know both. Know, review the functions of these muscles that we talked about in lab, but also know that as a whole, all rotator cuff muscles help to stabilize the shoulder joint. There they are. Okay, we are rounding third. Are you ready? So after we go through the anatomy and the muscles of each joint, we'll talk about some of the kinetic components. Remind me, what does a kinetic analysis mean? Study of? Kinetic means study of what? Can you hear me?
Motion.
Something more specific than that.
Study of action and forces.
Forces. So anytime we hear kinetic analysis, we're going to think of study of forces. So imprint in your brain together, kinetic, study of forces. It's good to check in with things we've already covered because we can't forget them. All right, so you can see in your notes there, when we talk about the study of forces of the glenohumeral joint, out of all of that complex of joints, what bears the most force? Well, of course, it's the glenohumeral joint. We have smaller joints, acromioclavicular, scapulothoracic, sternoclavicular, but obviously it is the glenohumeral joint that withstands the most force. The other joints help a little bit by taking some of the force, but it's really not, it's not even a comparison. The glenohumeral joint takes on most of the forces. Be able to give an example of each type of load on the glenohumeral joint. So I've given you, I'll post this today. I've given you some examples of compression versus tension forces on the glenohumeral joint. Think about lifting a weight like this. That motion is going to compress the head of the humerus into the glenoid cavity. When you get tackled, the head of the humerus is being compressed into the glenoid cavity. On the other hand, holding a weight down below you is a tension force. The weight of the bar and the weight here is pulling the head of the humerus apart from the glenoid. Or this guy, a stiff arm, that's a tension force. This guy's trying to tackle him, so he's pulling on his arm, and it's pulling the head of the humerus away from the glenoid cavity. Does that make sense? A shear or torsion force would be any kind of twisting force on the glenohumeral joint. Discus is a great example. Certain parts of the pitching motion. And then we can have a combined. So a lot of motions are put combined forces onto the shoulder. Okay, let me ask you, what is another example of a motion that will apply multiple forces on the glenohumeral joint? What is another example of a motion that will put combined forces onto the shoulder joint, the glenohumeral joint? Come on. What's an example of a motion that will have multiple forces on the shoulder? Think about sports where you're moving your shoulder.
Pitching.
Well, I gave you that example. What's another one?
Throwing a football.
Throwing a football,
Hitting a volleyball.
spiking a volleyball, shooting a lacrosse ball.
What about archery?
Well, let's think about it. When you're pulling back, there's some compression at the glenohumeral joint. But when you let go, I suppose there's some tension. I'm not that well versed on the technique, so I may be missing something.
Usually your arm is pulled back with your hand close to your jawline. Your elbow would be up perpendicular to your body.
Okay. Well, food for thought here, ladies and gentlemen. In preparation for our next exam, you may want to brainstorm, because I could ask you, what is an activity that applies a compressive force on the shoulder other than lifting a weight and getting tackled? So be able to give an example or two other than what's in the PowerPoint for each of these forces. Okay. Now, of course, in addition to just talking about force, we can also talk about how that force might be applied around an axis. Almost everyone got that question correct on our second exam. What is the term for force that occurs around an axis?
Torque.
torque. So most of these activities, the force isn't happening in a linear direction, especially when we talk about the combine. I mean, a baseball pitch, it's not just a linear force in one direction. So if a force is being generated in multiple planes, well, of course, we're going to have some torque. We're going to generate force around an axis as we move from one plane of motion to another. Let's see. We already talked about how we can calculate torque. So in your notes, I've just reviewed the calculation. We would find the torque of a shoulder motion by multiplying the weight of the arm times the perpendicular distance between the arm center of gravity and movement arm. You do not have to know that definition. That's a good thing, right? But I do want to make some points about torque and the shoulder. If you think about it, and this is written right in your notes there, the arm, in terms of its weight, is pretty light. Maybe your arm as a whole, humerus, radius ulna, wrist bones, hand, your arm may only make up 5% of your whole body weight. But because of the incredible motion that we have, we can generate large torques. I mean, you know that a baseball pitch is capable of producing incredible torque. The fact that we're able to produce incredible torque at the shoulder isn't so much a result of the weight. One way to increase our torque is to increase the weight of what we're moving. But we don't have a lot of weight that we're moving. So when we generate torque at the shoulder, it's not that we're getting a lot of it from the weight. We're getting a lot of it just from the speed of rotation. And also the length of the lever arm. I'm going to write this down on my notes, so when I'm writing my test questions, I make sure I'm clear on what we've talked about. So we know that we can generate a lot of torque at the shoulder, but it's not because of a great mass or weight of what we're moving. Instead, we can generate a lot of torque because of a great speed of rotation and a long lever arm. So we're able to generate a lot of torque because of a high speed of rotation and a long lever arm. Are you with me on that? Not so much because we have a lot of weight that we're moving around. Good. So here's an example of CC Sabathia. I mean, he's got a lot of weight in his body, which helps, but the weight of his arm isn't that much. But he can generate a lot of torque. Can we generate greater torque when the elbow is extended, or can we generate greater torque when the elbow is flexed?
Flexed.
Let me rephrase that. Maybe I didn't clarify well. Can we generate more torque at the shoulder when the elbow is flexed? Or can we generate more torque at the shoulder when the elbow is extended?
When it's extended.
So if I'm asking about the torque at the shoulder, you can generate more torque at the shoulder if the elbow is extended, because the lever arm is longer. But if I was asking you, can you generate more torque at the elbow if the elbow is flexed or extended, it would obviously be you can generate more torque at the elbow if it's flexed. The numbers here are always just examples. I would never ask you about these specific numbers. Okay. Let me just review. I know we're coming down to the end here. So we won't quite finish this chapter, but that's okay. I'll be able to finish this on Monday, and then we'll also start the elbow. You can see on your notes here some examples of how we might analyze torque and kinetics. You know, we've been focusing a lot on sports, but it doesn't have to be a sport where you can analyze kinetics and torque. So workplace ergonomics. I think I have a picture here. Hold on. All right, we don't, but it's okay. So we could apply this to helping us lessen force or torque when someone's working at a desk, right? Okay. I want to talk a little bit about this baseball pitching motion. You can see that I've divided it into some phases: wind up, early cocking, late cocking, follow through. And I've given you examples of the primary force on the glenohumeral joint. You don't need to memorize all of these, but I am going to point out some things that I would like you to know. Okay. Let's see some examples here. Shear, torque. Okay, neutral by position. Okay. So these are some questions that I'd like you to be able to answer. In which phase of the baseball pitch is there most force produced? In which phase is there the most torque produced? And then overall, because of these two, in which baseball pitching phase is the most stressful? So let's talk about these three questions to end our lecture today. Okay, so if you look at in which phase is there the most force produced at the shoulder and elbow? So we have some force. Remember, force is going to be measured in newtons. So we're looking at the cocking phase at the shoulder. And then look at the deceleration phase. I think the next one is torque, yeah. So looking at the shoulder, we've got some shear force in cocking. We've got some compressive force during the cocking. It may surprise you to learn that we have the most compressive force during the deceleration phase. So I'd like you to know that. Not the number, but just the answer to our first question here. So there's the most force produced at the shoulder during the deceleration phase. Apparently I can't spell. Deceleration would be similar to right before the follow through. Why don't we end with this last question? Why? Why is there the most compressive force after you release the ball? Compressive means that the head of the humerus is compressing into the glenoid. why is it that we have the most compressive force right after we release the ball?
Because everything's coming back from being extended.
That's true, but what is happening inside that makes it have so much compressive force? What do the rotator cuff muscles have to do after the ball is released?
Contract.
They have to do what?
Contract
Why?
to slow the shoulder down, or else it'll just, it's gotta slow down, so.
So you might think we would have the most compression when we're cocking back, but it's exactly what you just said. This motion coming back generates so much force, and then all of a sudden we release the ball, and the rotator cuff muscles have to contract so much to keep the head of the humerus attached. Deceleration, in order to keep the head of the humerus attached to the glenoid. Because otherwise, the arm would just fall off the body. So we produce, there's the most compressive force during the baseball pitch at the deceleration phase. And that is because the rotator cuff is contracting so much to stabilize the shoulder. So much force was generated. And then all of a sudden we release the ball. We got to contract those muscles as a brake. And the numbers are pretty striking, right? Almost twice as much compression as during the cocking phase. Okay, great. So we're going to finish this on Monday, and then we'll start the next chapter. I'll stick around if you have any more questions. Thank you for being patient with the sound.
Have a good one.
Have a good one.
Make sure you signed in, everyone.